Abstract API provides lookup for domain, phone, and IP address information. Tiered API. Abuse CH lets you check if a host, domain, IP address or netblock is malicious. Free API with Abuse IPDB checks IP addresses against a blacklist. Tiered API for Abuse 6 Mail Intelligence checks netblocks and IPs against its blacklist. Account Finder searches over 500 social and other websites such as Instagram, Reddit for possible associated accounts. Internal AdBlock check determines if link pages would be blocked by AdBlock+. Tiered API for AdGuard DNS checks if a host would be blocked by AdGuard DNS. Free API for AMIA searches the Tor AMIA search engine for mentions of the target. Free API for Alien Vault IP reputation checks if an IP or netblock is malicious. Free API for Alien Vault OTX obtains information from the Open Threat Exchange. Tiered API for Amazon S3 Bucket Finder searches for potential S3 buckets and attempts to list their contents. Free API for Apple iTunes searches iTunes for mobile apps. Free API for archive.org identifies historic versions of files and pages via the Wayback Machine. Free API for ARIN queries the ARIN registry for contact information. Free API for Azure Blob Finder searches for potential Azure blobs and attempts to list their contents. Base64 decoder identifies base64 encoded strings in URLs. Internal BGP view obtains network information. Internal binary edge provides data from internet scanning systems, including breaches, vulnerabilities, torrents, and passive DNS. Tiered APIs for Bing shared IPs and Bing search for hosts sharing the same IP, or to identify subdomains and links. Bitcoin Finder looks for Bitcoin addresses in scraped web pages. Internal Bitcoin who checks suspect or malicious Bitcoin addresses. Tiered API for Bitcoin abuse checks similar addresses. Free API for blockchain queries blockchain.info for wallet balances. Free API for blocklist.de checks if a net block or IP is malicious. Free API for BotScout searches the database of spammed IP addresses and email addresses. Tiered API for botvrj.eu checks if a domain is malicious. Free API for Build with Queries Build with Domain API for web technology, email addresses, and more. Tiered API for C99 queries geolocation, proxy detection, phone lookup, and other data. Commercial API for caller name looks up US phone number location and reputation. Free API for Senses obtains host information. Tiered API for certificate transparency gathers host names from historical certificates. Free API for CertSpotter gathers information about SSL certificates. Free API for SIN's Army list checks netblocks and IPs for malicious activity. Free API for CIRCLU obtains passive DNS and SSL data. Free API for cleanbrowsing.org checks if a host would be blocked by clean browsing DNS filters. Free API for CleanTalk spam list checks for netblocks or IPs on CleanTalk spam list. Free API for Clearbit checks names, addresses, domains, and more from email addresses. Tiered API for Cloudflare DNS checks if a host would be blocked by Cloudflare. Free API for CoinBlocker lists checks if a domain appears on CoinBlocker lists. Free API for Common Crawl searches URLs found through Common Crawl. Free API for Komodo Secure DNS checks if a host would be blocked by Komodo. Tiered API for Another Company Name Extractor identifies company names. Internal Cookie Extractor pulls cookies from HTTP headers. Internal Country Name Extractor identifies country names. Internal Credit Card Number Extractor finds credit card numbers. Tiered API for Crawlbit searches subdomains. Cross-referencer identifies affiliates by looking for links back to the target. Internal CRScavator searches for Chrome extensions. Internal Custom Thread Feed checks a host, domain, netblock, ASN, or IP against a custom feed. Free API for Cybercrime Tracker Net checks for malicious host or IP. Free API debounce checks whether an email is disposable. Free API for Delhashed gathers breach data. Commercial API for DigitalOcean Space Finder searches for DigitalOcean spaces and attempts to list contents. Internal DNS brute-forcer attempts to identify host names through brute-forcing. Internal DNS common SRV attempts to identify host names via SRV records. Free API for DNS for family checks if a host would be blocked. Internal DNS look-aside attempts to reverse or resolve adjacent IPs. Internal DNS raw records retrieves raw DNS records. Internal DNS resolver resolves hosts and IPs. Internal DNS zone transfer attempts to full zone transfer. Tiered API for DNSDB queries far sites historical and passive DNS data. Free API for DNS dumpster performs passive subdomain enumeration. Free API for DNS grep obtains passive DNS from Rapid7. Free API for drone BL queries for open relays, proxies, and vulnerable servers. Free API for DuckDuckGo queries for descriptive information. Internal email address extractor pulls emails. Internal email crawler searches for emails and phone numbers. Tiered API for email format looks up email addresses. Tiered API for email rep searches for email reputation. Free API for emerging threats checks net blocks or IPs on emerging threats. Internal error string extractor identifies common error messages. Internal Ethereum address extractor finds Ethereum addresses. Free API for Etherscan queries balances of Ethereum wallets. Internal file metadata extractor pulls metadata from documents and images. Free API for Flickr searches for domains, URLs, and emails related to the domain. Free API for Foxsec obtains IP information. Tiered API for FortiGuard anti-spam checks IPs for maliciousness. Tiered API for FraudGuard provides threat information. Free API for F-Secure Riddler obtains network information. Commercial API for Full Contact gathers domain and email info. Tiered API for Full Hunt identifies domain attack surface. Free API for GitHub finds public code repositories. Tiered API for Gleef looks up company information. Tiered API for Google Maps identifies physical addresses and coordinates. Free API for Google Object Storage Finder searches for buckets. Free API for Google Safe Browsing checks URLs against safe browsing lists. Free API for Google Custom Search finds subdomains and links. Free API for Graviter retrieves user info. Tiered API for Greyhound Warfare finds bucket names. Free API for GreenSnow checks net blocks or IPs. Free API for grep app searches for links and emails. Tiered API for Grey Noise community and Grey Noise provide IP enrichment. Tiered API for HackerOne unofficial checks if the target is listed by H1NOBD. Free API for hacker target searches for hosts sharing the same IP. Internal hash extractor finds MD5 and SHA hashes. Free API for Have I Been Warned checks hacked emails and breaches. Commercial API for hosting provider identifier finds hosting ranges. Tiered API for Host.io obtains domain information. Tiered API for Hunter.io checks email addresses and names. Free API for hybrid analysis finds domains and URLs. Internal IBAN number extractor finds IBANs. Internal ICNOW.io download checks torrents. Tiered API for IntelligenceX provides info on IPs, domains, emails, and phones. Internal interesting file finder looks for Office docs and zips. Free API for Internet Storm Center checks malicious IPs. Tiered APIs for IPPICO, IPPCOM, IPinfo, IP Quality Score, IPregistry, IPStack, and XenHoist provide geolocation, reputation, and WhoisInfo. Tiered API for Kudis searches mobile apps. Free API for LeakIX finds host data leaks. Free API for Leak lookup searches breach databases. Free API for Multiverse obtains malicious activity info. Free API for Malware Patrol searches malicious URLs and IPs. Tiered API for MetaDefender checks IP and domain reputation. Free API for Mnemonic passive DNS retrieves passive DNS data. Free API for multiproxy.org checks open proxies. Free API for MySpace gathers usernames and locations. Tiered API for NameAppy checks disposable emails. Tiered API for NetworksDB searches IP and domain info. Tiered API for NeutrinoAPI obtains phone, IP, and host reputation. Tiered API for NumVerify looks up phone location and carrier. Free API for OnionLink searches the Onion City engine. Free API for OnionCircangine.com searches the Onion search engine. Tiered API for ONIF checks threat data. Free API for OpenBug Bounty checks vulnerability reports. Free API for Open Corporates looks up company info. Free API for OpenDNS checks if a host is blocked. Free API for OpenNIC DNS resolves names in OpenNIC. Free API for OpenFish checks malicious hosts or domains. Free API for OpenStreetMap retrieves coordinates. Internal page information determines page features. Internal pastebin searches for related content. Internal PGP key servers look up email and domains. Free API for Fishstats checks net blocks or IPs. Free API for Fishtank checks host or domain maliciousness. Internal phone number extractor finds phone numbers. Internal port scanner checks common TCP ports. Free API for Project Honeypot queries the database for IPs. Commercial API for Project Discovery Chaos searches for hosts and subdomains. Free API for PSBDMP checks for hacked emails. Free API for Pulsedive obtains data. Tiered API for Punk Spider checks for vulnerabilities. Free API for Quad 9 checks if a host is blocked. Free API for Reverse Hoist does reverse whois. Free API for RIPE queries the RIPE registry. Tiered API for Risk IQ provides passive DNS and SSL. Free API for RobText searches hosts sharing the same IP. Free API for search code searches code repositories. Tiered API for Security Trails gives passive DNS and more. Commercial API for CN gathers intelligence on IPs, emails, and phones. Tiered API for SHA-DN obtains information on identified IPs. Internal similar domain finder searches for similar-looking domains. Free API for Skymim looks up emails. Free API for SlideShare gathers names and locations. Tiered API for Snuv gathers email IDs. Tiered API for Social Links queries social media and dark web. Tiered API for Social Media Profile Finder tries to discover social media profiles. Tiered API for Social Network Identifier checks presents on LinkedIn, Twitter, and others. Free API for SORBs queries for open relays, proxies, and vulnerable servers. Free API for spam cop checks net blocks or IPs. Free API for spam hosts and checks net blocks or IPs. Free API for Spirus checks malicious activity. Tiered API for spy on web checks hosts sharing IPs or analytics codes. Internal SSL certificate analyzer gathers SSL certificate info. Internal Stack Overflow searches for mentions of the target. Free API for Stephen Black hosts checks if a domain is malware or adware. Internal strange header identifier obtains non-standard HTTP headers. Internal subdomain takeover checker checks vulnerable subdomains. Internal sublist 3R passive DNS enumerates subdomains. Free API for Serbl checks netblocks, IPs, or domains in SURBL. Free API for Talus Intelligence checks maliciousness. Free API for TextMagic obtains phone number type. Tiered API for ThreadJammer checks IP maliciousness. Free API for ThreepCrowd obtains data on IPs, domains, and emails. Free API for ThreepFox checks IP maliciousness. Free API for ThreepMiner provides passive DNS and threat intel. Free API for TLD Searcher searches all TLDs for domains with the same name. Internal tool CMSeek identifies content management systems. Internal tool DNS Twist detects bit squidding, typo squats, and similar domains. Internal tool MScan scans for OpenNet BIOS NAMA servers. Internal tool Map identifies operating systems. Internal tool Nuclei is a fast customizable scanner. Internal tool Unisixtion finds exposed SNMP services. Internal tool Retire.js scans for vulnerable JavaScript libraries. Internal tool Snallygaster finds file leaks and other security problems. Internal tool tests LSH checks TLS SSL weaknesses. Internal tool Trufflehog searches Git repositories for secrets. Internal tool WAF00F identifies web application firewalls. Internal tool WAPLIZR identifies technologies. Internal tool WATWeb identifies software. Internal tool Tor exit nodes checks if an IP appears on the Tor exit list. Free API for Torch searches the Torch search engine. Free API for Trash Panda queries pastes for mentions of the target. Free API for TrueMail checks disposable emails. Free API for Twilio obtains phone number info. Free API for Twitter gathers names and locations. Free API for UsePredict checks netblocks or IPs. Free API for Erlskin.io searches cache for domain info. Free API for Venmo gathers user info. Free API for ViewDNS.info identifies co-hosted sites and performs reverse whois. Tiered API for Virus Total obtains data on identified IPs. Free API for VoIP blacklist checks malicious IPs or net blocks. Free API for VxVault.net checks malicious domains or IPs. Internal Web Analytics Extractor pulls Web Analytics IDs. Internal Web Framework Identifier identifies popular frameworks. Internal Web Server Identifier obtains server banners. Internal Web Spider parses web pages. Tiered API for WhatComes checks web technology. Tiered API for Hysology does reverse whois. Internal whois performs whois lookups. Tiered API for Hoxie does reverse whois. Free API for Wiggle queries nearby Wi-Fi access points. Free API for WikiLeaks searches for mentions. Free API for Wikipedia edits identifies edits from a given IP or username. Tiered API for Force Exchange obtains IP reputation and passive DNS. Free API for Yandex DNS checks if a host is blocked. Free API for Zetalytics queries the database for hosts on the target domain. Tiered API for Zonafile.io searches domain info. Free API for Zona defacement check sees if a host name appears on the Zona defacement feed.